Our next presenter is Scott Bell, who will be visualising 21st century boulevards. Scott is studying a Bachelor of Arts in animation and game design, so very, very applicable to this particular project. And in particular, it's looking at the topic of trackless trams. And at this point, I think I will pass on to Scott.
Thank you very much. My name's Scott Bell, and I'm working on the Visualising 21st Century Boulevards project. It's been a very interesting project thus far. Much has been learned, and it's been an interesting melding of many different workflows and pipelines. But to begin, I'd just like to quickly go over how I've laid this out. To begin with, the objectives, what the project itself was looking to do, the methodology of how I went about doing that, some differences of that methodology to alternate methods, the results, a small conclusion, some thoughts on the future of the project and the pipeline, my acknowledgements, and then we'll end with some questions. To begin with the objectives, boiling down many of the objectives that I was given, I wanted to focus on and showing how trackless trams were good for urban regeneration, how these mid-tier transit options would be very applicable to modern boulevards and urban design, and how useful they are. Trackless trams being a form of transport that are similar to trains but require no rail and can be installed on ordinary roads almost anywhere. They're energy efficient and more energy and environmentally friendly than buses in some regards. The next part was the design of the boulevard itself, taking inspiration from older boulevards, for example, 15th to 16th century Parisian boulevards, where the focus was on people more so than vehicles. Large livable spaces where you could walk the dog, have a picnic, or any number of things, but it also didn't forget that vehicles were a thing. Of course, back then, more carts and horses. We wanted to take that idea and merge it with 21st century technology, such as solar power, electric vehicles, things like electric scooters, and as well as disability mobility as well. And of course, boiling all of this together and packaging into an immersive virtual reality environment to really show the environment in a way that normal fly-throughs and still images simply can't. To go over the methodology, it stems much from my experience in animation and game design, wherein the modeling and the overall workflow of a project is slightly different to what you'd expect from an architectural viewpoint. It's different to normal renders in the way that it needs to render frames many times a second, even up to a few hundred a second if your PC is strong enough, which differs from ordinary architectural renders in many ways, because even a still render, a single frame for an architectural model, can take hours, if not even days in some instances, to render. Game engines, while powerful and fast, do have certain requirements, but I believe they make up for these partial negatives with an astounding amount of positives. Optimization is the name of the game when it comes to building games, and in this project that was of course a major consideration that had to be taken. The methodology follows a three-step process: pre-production, production, and post-production, which is fairly standard across many methods, but I'll go into more detail about the games design version of them as well. Pre-production is, of course, when you, before you get into actually building what you're wanting to build, you need to figure out exactly what it is you're going to build. Some early design work, finding, creating, sourcing references to inform the design. It's a process of how to best create what you're wanting to create. Early iteration as well is where I would place in pre-production. And it's one of the most important steps by far. And generally in our project, we wanted this to be done fairly quickly so we could jump straight into production. Production's where the meat of time and effort comes into building anything, especially in a game engine. Modeling, texturing, implementation, and testing is the general flow that you need to have, and you repeat that until it's done. But each one of these has its own sub workflow that you need. Modeling can be as simple as taking a box and turning it into a building, or taking an already established model and making it more efficient for a game engine, process called retopology. Texturing is also, can either be simple or not simple. It can involve 3D sculpting and projecting normals and the details of a building from an extremely high resolution mesh, which can't be used in a game engine, to a low resolution, which can. Most of the time in our project was spent in this phase, where, as you can see, we went through many different iterations and taking things in and out, testing them, seeing if they work, and if they don't, taking them back out, redoing them, bringing them back in, which is a major strength of this workflow, as it's really fast. You can iterate very, very quickly, and if you need to make even significant changes, you can do so very quickly. Which brings us into post-production. Post-production is where things differ a little bit from ordinary projects. Post-production in this particular project involved things like lighting, post-processing, and sound, which ordinarily would take place in the production phase. However, post-production for this methodology takes place here. This is also where you do a lot of your play testing as well, or sending them out for alpha and beta testers. It's also where a lot of the more visual high fidelity comes in. It's at this point that you would also package the build to be exported and given to anyone that requires it. The main differences of this particular workflow when compared to another modeling workflow is interaction, iteration speed, the flexibility of the engine, its ability to render in real time, and most notably is its ability to show anything you build in many different ways. You could have the same environment shown on a computer screen, through a VR headset, or even on your phone, if you so chose, which I believe is the true power of this workflow, is just its flexibility and how many things you can build from simple working blocks. As an example of a more traditional workflow, these buildings are built in Navisworks. These are the buildings that I was given and had to rework into more workable buildings. These buildings themselves are constructed of millions upon millions of polygons, which an engine such as Unity or another game engine, for example, such as Unreal Engine, simply cannot run. However, many of the same established blocks can still be used. Taking these buildings and effectively rebuilding them allows you to have a lot more power and control over a lot of the things you don't need to show, which is a lot easier to build and is a lot easier on the designer as well, because if you don't need it and it never shows, then unlike an architectural visualization where every screw, every chair, every light fixture is important, not so much in ours. And it's this power that I believe is very powerful for any kind of quick iterative visualization project. The results of our project came about into a walkable VR environment. You can move around, interact with objects. It has a good amount of visual fidelity. And as it's so flexible, it's extremely easy to make changes to. If I don't like the color of something, I can change it. If I want to make something slightly bigger or move it, I can do that without having to re-render anything. And I do believe it's a good test of the production method. It requires a bit of refinement, as it's still very much in its early stages, but I do believe it is a good result to have. It's a little rough around the edges, but I believe it's a good example of what can be done. Brings me on to my conclusion. It's rough but encouraging, very encouraging. It's an excellent proof of concept in my opinion, and while it does provide its own unique challenges, specifically in taking things such as architectural renderings and having to move them into a much lower resolution, much quicker and different workflow while retaining its visual fidelity, I do believe that any cons are outweighed by positives. And early show testing to many different people, such as city councils, have shown much interest, and there are already talks of further projects with this workflow, which we're all very excited for. Which brings us on to the future. This particular workflow, I believe, has a bright future. Any sort of visualization project or anything you could ever want to create could be built using this workflow and is available to almost anyone. That brings me to my acknowledgements. A very special thanks to everyone in the HIVE. Their help was instrumental in the creation of this project. I can't thank them enough. A special thanks to all of my supervisors as well, and everyone else who helped on the project. Thank you. Any questions?